Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. Rumman is one of the world's leading AI ethics experts. She actually did her PhD in political science and has done a lot of work in social sciences, especially quantitative analysis in social sciences. And I found, as you'll hear me say in the interview, I found this one of the most refreshing conversations I've had with someone in the so-called tech and ethics world, because she actually knows a lot about moral philosophy. And as you'll hear me gripe again at one point, where I've often found myself frustrated when I hear people talk about technology and ethics, because they have such naive and often simplistic views of what it's going to entail to have tech in conversation with ethics. And I said, often I find myself thinking, have you ever read any moral philosophy of the last 200 or 300 years? And her reply was, I assure you, they have not. So that's troubling. But in any case, I found this a really helpful conversation. There are some jewels in here. We probably sometimes got a little too geeky, hopefully not too overly technical, but I found this a very helpful conversation. And I talked to Rumman. She was in Riyadh, I think, at the day we taped this interview, and was so honored to have her with us. As you'll hear us say, at least allude to, Rumman was the head of what we might call the AI ethics team at Twitter, and had made a lot of interesting progress and a lot of fascinating realizations, research that had been done, and then she was summarily dismissed when Elon Musk took over Twitter. So anyway, fascinating conversation, fascinating human being, remarkable work that she's doing. Hope you enjoy this with Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. Dr. Rumman Chowdhury is a data scientist, social scientist, and leading expert in AI ethics. She's the CEO and co-founder of Humane Intelligence, a nonprofit that builds community governance and accountability for AI systems. Formerly, she was director of the machine learning ethics team at Twitter and global lead for responsible AI at Accenture. She's advised governments and corporations and serves as a key public voice on creating ethical AI. Dr. Chowdhury, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, grateful to have you with us. We academics always like to see what other people have written in their dissertations, and so I started kind of.
Did you look at mine?
I did. Not as much time as I would have liked, but here's what's so interesting to me. I mean, it seems to me that, as I understand what you're doing in your dissertation, that you've been fascinated for a long time with mechanisms of power, and the way in which a powerful industry or interest group may so deeply influence the rules, priorities, decisions of an institution that the institution then stops serving the common good. And
That's right.
So if that is a fair kind of summary, I'm interested to know what got you interested in that kind of problem? What got you hooked on paying attention to mechanisms of power and how they work?
Maybe I'm a little bit too trained in the school of rational thought. That was a very particular era in social science, and that was the era of quantitative social science. And the schools that I went to. So I went to UCSD, which is a big, rat choice school. But while I appreciate that econometric modeling and game theory, et cetera, can be limited, like all modeling is limited, right? Like that's why it's a model and not an actual representation of the real world. I do find them to be very, very useful. And models are literally driven by incentive structures. So I find maybe comfort in knowing that individual humans are actually very, very hard to predict, but macro level trends, if modeled correctly, you can really see how things will play out. So, often you find yourself, if you can peel back the incentive mechanisms that are set by the systems of power, you are kind of unsurprised at where things end up. And I'll tie it a little bit to tech. People seem surprised every time a for-profit organization chooses profit over people. And, the cynical reality is, why would they, right? I mean, it is very nice for a CEO to say things that sound really great. But at the end of the day, they are responsible to their shareholders. We learned that at Twitter, the term of fiduciary responsibility. They are not only incentivized, they're legally required to. So why are we surprised when corporations act in their own best interest? And I was laughing on my dissertation, but it was interesting because at that time, like I didn't work in tech. My PhD is in political science and American politics, and my dissertation was about the military-industrial complex and how it impacted the development of San Diego, where I went to school. comparing it to places like Las Vegas, where they both started off very similarly, and Vegas went in one direction towards tourism, and San Diego went the other direction towards military, and basically pointing out that single economy regions tend to underinvest in social capital and public infrastructure
Mm.
because, as you mentioned, they rely very heavily on industry to supply that. And I feel like it was almost prescient that it ended up in tech, which is another, in the Bay Area, another very dominant single industry. And what we're seeing is what we've seen over time is the death of culture, infrastructure, community support in places like San Francisco because tech came in and supplied all of that. It gave tech workers all of that. And today, as that gets pulled back, as companies don't really feel a need anymore to pay lip service or pay money towards things like personal development, because we're in this very ruthless time of pure corporate development. It's interesting to see my dissertation play out in big tech.
Yeah. Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question was, that at what point did you all of a sudden begin to say, oh, okay, that I was describing now is playing out in big tech. Um,
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
so you used an interesting phrase there as you were describing that process. I think the phrase you used there was death of culture. Um, and as I got to dig around a little bit in your dissertation, as I understand what you're pointing to there is that as you have these single economic powers in these regions, that in a way that it's not bribery, right, or it's not some sort of explicit corruption, but it's just the mechanisms of economic power then can begin to undercut democratic will of the people in service to a single economic power. Is that again a fair assessment?
That's right. And really specifically, let's tie it back to the 2008 financial crisis. During that time, most Americans felt like many of our institutions failed us, right? So if you were, somebody my age, like an older millennial or any sort of a millennial, you entered a very brutal job market where people had college degrees and couldn't even get a job making coffee. And we felt like government didn't do anything for us. The only industry that did show up was tech. So this was, peak tech is doing everything for you. There's buses that take you to work, right? In Mountain View, the Google bus takes you to work. There were free bikes available for anybody in the
Mm,
community, not just tech workers. You can just pick up a bike and bike around. They paid for everything from people's dry cleaning. They fed you at work. They provided pet care. Things like mental health services and IVF were beyond the realm of contemplation at that time. And a lot of the things that have trickled down into your typical corporate environment, things like, dressing in a more relaxed way, being more comfortable with, different types of like home setups or work structures, all of that came from tech. So at this very particular time where we were in in a national economic crisis, people felt like tech companies were the only companies that showed up and
mm,
actually helped their employees, again, not just with a salary and a job, but with the kind of infrastructure that you would normally expect from government. Over time, of course, we've seen that decline quite a bit. But the culture, for example, feeding employees nutritious meals and giving them snacks at work remains, something that tech introduced and perpetuated. And again, it's something that, and it's ironic because tech salaries are the most generous of any industry, and yet we're the ones that get all of our needs taken care of and paid for.
mm. I wonder, have you ever read Jacques Ellul, the
Mhm.
French sociologist? Yeah,
Yep.
I've been fascinated for a long time with his kind of magisterial work, Technological Society,
Yep.
and there where he talks about technique as this relentless pursuit of the most efficient means without regard to ends, and he makes this critique that as technique continues to have a dominating power, that it corrodes all forms of community, whatever that form of community might be. Do you feel like that kind of approach simply towards technique, his insight about critique, might be brutally true?
It is it is painfully true in tech. You see this adulation of the programmer. So what's really fascinating is I'm a quantitative social scientist. So I've been programming since undergrad. I went to MIT. I actually didn't know that everybody in political science didn't learn MATLAB and R and Stata. So for me, programming languages were just another tool or technology that I use. I didn't think it was particularly impressive to, let's say, have many languages under my belt. And I think that was very surprising to me in Silicon Valley when I first entered, was this adulation of programming. And people would ask you, oh, do you know Python? Do you know this? Do you know that? And I'm like, yeah, like what's the big deal, right? It's just a thing I type. But the hard part isn't that. In my mind, the hard part was conceiving the design of what an experiment would be and what the implementation would look like. And it was all the thinking work and not just the technique of it all. But Silicon Valley loves boiling things down to the extremely tangible. I mean, to the point that, a lot of people in tech don't see the value in even reading books. But why read a book when you can read a blog post or a summary or
Mm.
AI will do it for you? And we see that extension, that mentality that started with something I saw over 15 years ago, where people would ask me how many programming languages I knew. And I was baffled by the question, did not understand why that was so important to people. Today clearly translates into why bother reading books when AI can summarize it for you. So yes, I mean, I've seen it, truly manifest. And again, it's in this mentality, this adulation of literally the engineer, right? The one who creates the technique is the most revered role in
Mm.
tech. Whereas in almost any other industry, an engineer is like a tinkerer. You're the doer, not the thinker, not the manager, not the leader. You're just the grunt. Only in tech is that turned on its head.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the ways I began to see the helpful insights of Elul, and I was reading him 10 or 15 years ago, but I remember him talking about the way in which Greek society and Greek philosophy, science was seen as a form of awe and a form of wonder at the beauty of the world. And technology was almost was a threat because it had this sort of the story, right, of the ring, that if the old myth where if the guy wears the ring, he becomes invisible and it leads to his own corruption,
Mhm.
and sees that sort of the magic, if you will, of applied technology as something that's dangerous, whereas science, the theoretical, was seen as a great gift of awe and wonder. But it's like we've turned it on its head, where the only thing that really matters is applied technique. I don't know, thoughts on that?
Right. Yes, absolutely. So specifically today, I work a lot on test and evaluation of generative AI models. And my primary argument is the concept of evals or evaluation should be drawn from statistical analysis, which is specifically my background. Now, while for many reasons, generative AI models cannot be analyzed statistically the way machine learning models could, they're not the same sort of, they're probabilistic models, not deterministic models. So I can't use the same modeling techniques. It is surprising, or maybe not surprising, that the field of developing scientifically robust evaluations is not a field in of itself. The field has glossed over the fact that our methods of evaluating these models are deeply unscientific and they are more driven by ideology and policy. So to your
Mm.
point, there is instead of identifying a very, very big gap in scientific language and scientific robustness, instead, this entire industry falls back on ideological argumentation. Is existential risk more important or is societal impact more important? Is it, like some people would make the argument that AI could kill us all. So why should we be so concerned if we're making discriminatory outputs? These are ideological conversations. I cannot have a scientific discourse if what we're basing it on is my feelings
Mm.
or my individual perspective on the world. And again, for a field that loves to emphasize how rational it is, our way of um, talking about the performance of our AI models is purely based in individual perceptions that is purposefully obfuscated and driven by tech companies. So instead of, again, investing in it as a scientific process by which different parties can come to an agreement by agreeing upon a particular methodology, it's based on who has the most political power, policy, media influence, and things that companies are actually quite good at.
So, yeah, there's so much there I'd like to dig into as time allows us there. But first, let me ask you to describe the critique that you have made of moral outsourcing that's at play in all this.
So the concept of moral outsourcing was something I really observed when I joined Accenture as the responsible AI lead. And I saw the way engineers and actually in general media would talk about AI models. There's this type of language we use that we've never used before, where we anthropomorphize the technology. And we say things like AI will replace teachers or AI diagnoses disease better than a doctor. And I noticed two things about that language, well, three things about that language. First is that it gives this intent or a will to an AI system that's not real, which is why today we see people suffering from AI psychosis, that believe people who believe AI is alive and it is, it is exerting free will. So that's problem number one, which directly stems from the linguistic construct. The part number two I draw from Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil, which is,
Mm.
isn't it convenient that we can, if anything bad happens, we can blame this abstraction, this institution of AI, not me as the engineer or someone as a product implementer or someone as a designer or not the CEO of the company. And this very much aligns with the Banality of Evil, which is basically this idea that many people who participate in evil regimes, and specifically she was talking about the Nazi regime, did not see themselves as contributing to the evilness of that regime because they felt like they were doing a mundane job. And in looking at the trials of a lot of these Nazi soldiers, they would say things like, I just signed paperwork or I just drove a truck. Like, yeah, you drove a truck of gas canisters, to a concentration camp. What did you think you were doing? And we see that same thing, like as people are complicit in building systems of mass surveillance, discrimination, they don't believe that they're complicit in it. And part of that is, again, because of this anthropomorphizing language. How convenient then, if something goes wrong, you can say, oh, wow, the AI really did something. And again, we see that language today as we're building agentic AI systems. Literally just yesterday, I saw a headline where some company's entire D drive, like their entire database, was deleted by an agentic AI system.
Oh,
But again, instead of identifying it as poor user specification or this company not putting sufficient safeguards to prevent these things from happening, it was like, oh, the AI deleted a company's file. Like, the AI doesn't do anything of its own will. It did not intend to do it. The third thing that's very insidious about sentences like that is it completely removes human beings, you and I, from the process. So here is an AI, and it is taking jobs away from teachers. So these teachers are just subject to this all-knowing, completely, better than us, never needs to sleep. This being that is super intelligent. What are we to do? So for the average person, it is frightening and it is alienating because in those sentences, you are just subject to the whims of this AI system instead of what it really is, which is, again, systems of power operating in a very particular way.
how are you finding people in the tech world responding to your insistence then that humans have to continue to be responsible for the choices that they make and the way those choices inform these systems and the outputs of those systems?
Yeah, I mean, overwhelmingly, I think there is agreement. One of the big gaps and one of the roles that I play when I work with companies is, as a translator, right? So there's one thing to have a social imperative, a moral imperative, a design imperative to say, oh, we need to build systems that are not discriminatory. I think everybody can agree on that. That's not the problem. The problem is in the implementation. What does it mean to actually make a system what does that look like in practice? How do I test for it? How do I build it? That's the thing that I'm quite good at, is translating, and this is what social scientists do, right? A quantitative social science, especially, we take these nebulous concepts, even something like democracy, right? I mentioned social capital was a subject of my dissertation. How does one measure social capital, right? So you take this concept and you drive it into a practical measurement, appreciating that measurement will never be perfect. But what that does is it creates something tangible and implementable for somebody who is building the technical tool. Because remember, the technical person is actually at the bottom of the food chain. They're just the one executing. So if they're the one executing, then somebody has to define the execution for them. But simply coming and saying, you built a racist system, fix it, is really difficult for someone to really grapple, especially with highly complex systems like Gen AI systems. But yeah, overwhelmingly, I think there is a lot of reception for it, especially again in the era of Gen AI and agentic AI. And people really want to understand how they can build better systems.
Uh, for those who are perhaps unfamiliar with some of the ways in which these systems have propagated racist presumptions. Give some examples of some of the most basic, egregious examples of that.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is, this predates generative AI. ChatGPT really just put this technology in everybody's hands, so it's easy for you to see. Machine learning systems perpetuate the same thing. So we have seen models being used to determine riskiness for loans and lending that reflected discriminatory practices historically of who gets like loans and how. And particularly, we see it manifest in places like Boston and Chicago, where Black communities were specifically redlined and excluded from lending for no other reason other than the fact that they were people of color. That same model gets perpetuated and built into AI systems. Traditionally, AI systems were not as good as identifying um, darker skin tones, women's features. We've also seen AI being used in the medical system in discriminatory fashion. Again, all of this is just a reflection of existing inequities and biases in our systems. I can go on and on. There are often hiring AI that are built that discriminates against women when it comes to tech because we are so underrepresented in tech. And again, it's not imputing anything about you. It just figures out that you're a woman, indexes based on what it knows, which is that there are very few women, and decides that a safer bet is to go with a man simply because men are overrepresented, right? So it's creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Um, a lot of image detection. One thing that was quite concerning to me, which is we've seen an uptick in again, is phrenology and eugenics. Essentially, that your facial expressions and your bone structure can determine things like trustworthiness.
Mm.
And unsurprisingly, a lot of that pseudoscience is based on eugenics and racism, right? That certain features were just deemed more trustworthy, and those happened to be aligned with white Anglo-Saxon features and not, features that are associated with other races. And again, just because you mechanize it, just because you gather data around it, does not make it better or anti-racist or non-discriminatory.
I think your work at Twitter saw some, for example, the ways the algorithms would crop images in a particular way that is another example of that.
Yes, absolutely. So when I first joined Twitter, actually when I was interviewing at Twitter, uh, one of I call them citizen data scientists on social media, realized that the Twitter image cropping algorithm tended to crop images towards white men, and not towards people of darker skin tone. And then over time, well, like white, lighter skin tone, darker skin tone. And then other people noticed it seemed to have a male gaze. In other words, it would crop images of men to their face and women to their chest. And then we
Huh.
actually did a scientific analysis of this, where we actually looked at, whether or not this is true across a wide range of images. And we found that the model tended to prefer lighter skinned, younger looking white women. And this is unsurprising because that is the bulk of media. When we are sold things often by attractive young girls, like young women. So that also requires understanding where this model comes from. So the image cropping model, which sounds like a highly objective, data-driven algorithm, actually comes from eye tracking data. So it's thousands and thousands of images being put in front of people and recorded, and the camera would pick up where people's eyes would go naturally. Now, what that does is it picks up people's preferences, and
Huh.
people's preferences are influenced by society, which again sells us things and with young women, attractive young white women, and tells us that that is the ideal of beauty. So yes, unsurprisingly, this algorithm is going to pick up what society is reinforcing, the beauty standards that society has been reinforcing. And again, there are so many steps in between. You would wonder, how does that become an image cropping algorithm on a social media platform? But just a great example of how a societal bias gets translated into a technical tool, really without anybody realizing, because the model itself was open source and the implementation was done at Twitter. And then, the average Twitter user probably didn't know or even understand where that model came from. And it was not until, again, citizen data scientists on the platform really identified these issues that it really came to light.
One other example I'd like for you to expound upon quickly, that you also found at Twitter that what news stories from right-wing outlets were propagated more than left-leaning outlets. Is that correct?
Yes. So our probably the most well-known research we did was on the concept of algorithmic amplification. And the question was, does the Twitter algorithm, the content curation algorithm that we built in-house, does it have a particular political slant compared to the reverse chronological algorithms? I want to be very nitpicky and picky on my language here. So number one, no matter what the content curation, it is all an algorithm. All an algorithm is a method of selecting content. And quite literally, every media outlet needs to do that. If it is a human being doing it, it's a human driven algorithm. If it is reverse chronological, meaning by timestamp, that is also an algorithm. And that also has its own biases, right? So people kind of use this lazy language and they call it the algorithm versus not. There is no not. And the reason for that is quite simple. There are millions of pieces of content that I can show you at any given time on any social media platform, right? Twitter, TikTok, whatever, right? Millions, literally hundreds of millions. How do I pick from that pool? Imagine it's like a big bucket of content, and I can stick my hand and I can pull out stuff. How do I choose? And that is the challenge that every media company, even your news media, they're all faced with that same challenge. And they all create some method of content curation. Now, usually what happens is the company itself creates a series of algorithms that does that content curation. And it's based on a wide range of things. It could be based on our imputation of who you are. It could be based on geography. It could be based on freshness. It could be based on popularity, many different, it's very complicated. So you wanted to look at whether or not, because Twitter and many social media companies, especially at that time, were being accused of left-wing bias. We were accused of promoting left-wing content. So we did an analysis and we did our best to share as much of our data as possible. And we actually found that in 7 out of 8 democracies, and this included, Europe, like 5 or 6 different European countries, Canada and the US, that actually it shifted center right. So the content that tended to be promoted by the algorithm was center right content. So here's where the story gets more interesting. So it's one thing to see the output, right, which is that there's center right content. What is hard to figure out is why. So I think people's knee-jerk reaction to algorithmic bias, like the algorithm must have somehow known that there is, some sort of a whatever leaning content, and it highlighted that information and it wants to bring that up. Or, which was my hypothesis, it's the algorithm doing what it's intended to do, which is actually surface popular content. The purpose of an algorithm is to keep you on the platform, right? Like at least the way for-profit media companies are going to want to make it, right? They make money if you're looking at their stuff. They're going to create algorithms that curate stuff that you want to look at. That seems pretty sensible to do. So what happens when it's April to August of 2020 and it's peak, Trump right before elections, and really all we're consuming all the time is something about right-wing content? Then what does fair look like in that situation? So the algorithm, to be clear, is not biased. It's performing as expected, which is that it is giving people the content that they interact with. So this is my working hypothesis on it. Unfortunately, we were all laid off by Elon Musk before we were able to complete our analysis. But to be perfectly frank, my working hypothesis was not that we had algorithmic bias, but that people were being served content that was related to the content they were looking at. So who gets to decide what fair is? Is fair 50-50? What happens in a 200-party parliamentary system, like some parts of Europe have? I don't, that's way above my pay grade. And the question to ask yourself is, who is the appropriate party to answer that question? Is it a government that regulates that? Is it the CEO of the social media company that says, I have defined fairness as this? Because we don't have a measurement of fairness or equity as it relates to, political positioning, because political positioning is just a function of the societal norms of the time, right? There are certain topics we talk about, and where the Overton window is, where the acceptable range of conversation is not this objective. It's not an objective viewpoint. It shifts, right? So if this were
Right.
the 1970s, you could have very frank conversations about whether it's okay for men to beat their wives, and that would be totally fine. Some men would be like, yeah, sometimes she gets out of place and I got to hit her in the face, right? That is how men talked in the 70s. It is not how men talk, at least they shouldn't be talking like that today. It's not acceptable to talk like that today. And that is an example of an Overton window shifting. So when we don't have, and again, this is why I draw on my background as a political scientist, there's no such thing as a purely objective viewpoint on many of the topics that are hot button topics. So it's power dynamics that determine what these algorithms are curating, what is allowed and what isn't, rather than scientific objectivity.
Yeah. So let me see if I can summarize and put a point on it. So from much earlier disciplines, let's say writing of history, no historian can say everything, and thus they must choose what they're going to say and what they're going to talk about. And that becomes a subjective preference, not some objective norm that they are submitting to. Same thing with journalists, right? A paper can't write about everything, but they have to make judgments, subjective judgments about what they're going to write about and what they're going to choose to give their attention to. And then with social media and the respective algorithms of social media companies, they're doing the same sort of thing. They have to make a subjective judgment about what they're going to serve up to their readers, to their consumers. And as a former guest of ours recently, Garrett Graff, is making the case that a lot of times that is being driven by how much engagement you can get. And they discovered that anger is something that will keep you more engaged, and thus very often serving up things that make you angry. So we have this sort of, I think, in my perspective, that's sort of a non-controversial observation, but one that we don't talk about that much. This is a subjective reality that undergirds history, it undergirds journalism, and it undergirds social media companies. But then that raises a question. Yeah, so that raises a question, I think, both for the historian, the journalist, and the social media companies, is what are the subjective norms that are undergirding these choices, right? And so it's a sort of question about, maybe more pointedly, what are your standards? We might call it, what's your standard of truth? What are you judging to be true, and how are you giving an account of what you judge to be true? So move us into that kind of consideration of, do there have to be judgments at a very real level of saying, well, I think this is true, I think this is not true, and that this also is a subjective reality that's informing algorithms?
Yes, and then we kind of come back full circle to how we started this conversation, which is everything is about systems of power and institutional incentives. So again, going back to my comment about at Twitter, we painfully learned that fiduciary responsibility was more important than impact on democracy and society. I think everybody understood very, very clearly what it meant for Elon Musk to take over Twitter, that him taking over what everybody knew to be the public town square meant that he would, do, and I'm not saying anything that he has not said that he would do himself, right? That he wants to control public narrative. He wants to influence what, the AI models that he's building on this content says based on his political perspectives and ideologies. So he is actually quite explicit about, tipping the scale in the direction that he wants it tipped in, right? And that hand was forced because of fiduciary responsibility. So he offered more to buy the company than the company was worth. And because the economic construct of for-profit companies says that your responsibility is to your shareholders, meaning the people who gain to make or lose money from you, what the board said, and again, we can argue whether or not this is true, but what the board said is that given this fiduciary responsibility, we have to take this deal, even though we can all agree that this person's only going to do terrible things with this platform once he has it. And that was, I think it broke everyone's heart a little bit, because we all, even those of us who worked at Twitter, believed, and we did, felt like we had a higher mission, but that was culture. That was not, that was very, very different. So you're asking about norms. One of the most dangerous things about AI is that there is this belief that data brings objectivity. And we're seeing that a lot with generative AI systems. So with every new iteration of this technology, we are further and further removed from the original source and content that we're getting it from, right? So let's say, we're just, as you rightfully pointed out, social media companies curated content to keep people drawn in, and in some cases, like, encouraged polarization as a result. At least one can say you looked at original content. So it was my tweet and your tweet and Donald Trump's tweet, and the content curated was actually genuinely from me, right? It wasn't fabricated. Generative AI takes us a step away from that. And now, and even a search engine like Google search engine, you're seeing the original content, the website itself, the blog post, the media article. Generative AI is a synthesis machine. So now we're taking all of that content, we're slapping in on top of the curation layer another layer of synthesis, which is this model's interpretation of how this information should be shared. And again, that too is now another layer of subjectivity that's built by a for-profit company, not by, let's say, a journalist who may feel that their responsibility is media accuracy, or a librarian who might feel that curating the right books is about expanding your breadth of knowledge. Now it is, again, the same incentive structure for-profit companies. So this synthesis of content is now another layer of obfuscation, because you really then don't see where this data and information is coming from. So now you're even further removed from where the source is. And I'll add one more thing. The best place to see that is in something called refusals, which importantly is, what does the model not talk about? And really pressing the model in different directions. And some of the work I do in test and evaluation is actually about testing biases based on what the model doesn't say, or how maybe these models dance around issues that are maybe a little bit inflammatory or not acceptable to certain people that they want to be more acceptable for.
What's some examples of that?
Well, I've heard that DeepSeek models that come out of China don't actually talk about issues that relate to China. I know that in the US, for example, there are refusals that relate to particular like salient issues in US history, issues of slavery. I have heard anecdotally that the model gives you refusals as it relates to the situation in Gaza with Palestine and Israel. And also like here, in a lot of these issues, and again, I'm going to try to remove this from individual perspectives and ideology as much as possible, because that is my job as a scientist, right? But there is no objective way to report on the situation in Gaza, because it is, again, purely ideological. It is not, for many people, it is not actually based in fact. It's based on your feelings in the situation. I may call it a genocide. Plenty of Israelis would say they're taking their birthright back, right? I don't know how to talk to those people. Those people don't know how to talk to me, because we don't have common grounding. So when models are reporting the situation, it is interesting to see who they call an aggressor, who they call a terrorist, who they call a victim, right, in writing this narrative and writing the story. And again, the dangerous part is not so much the subjectivity, but that there is this belief that because there is so much data behind it, that it is somehow objective, when we would easily call out a media outlet and say, that's biased the way you've written that. People don't feel the same level of comfort saying this AI model is demonstrating that kind of a bias and subjectivity.
I must say, I find this conversation so refreshing, even though it's terrifying. I mean, the reason I find it refreshing is that, as somebody who's done my own academic work in the field of ethics, for decades now, I've looked at the conversations that would come up in tech and ethics, and there would be these naive presumptions that, oh, look, all we have to do is come up, program it to keep 3 basic rules, and if it'll keep these 3 basic rules, everything will be fine. And it was like I was banging my head against the wall thinking, have none of these people read any moral philosophy for the last 100 years, right? It's like,
I can guarantee you they have not, or they've read the Cliff's Notes version of it.
Yeah. But, it's like anybody who's done much of that work knows that the modern project to come up with some sort of set of ethical norms that are agreeable, quote, to all rational people failed, right? And it's that what we saw over and over again was the norms that you come up with are inseparable from the narratives and the stories and the subjectivities of a community. And then out of that patchwork of things, we come up with these things that we hold to as moral norms. And so, it's just been exasperating to me to hear the naivete with which a lot of so-called AI ethicists talk about these things. And so I'm very appreciative that the subtlety and the nuance with which you're having these sorts of conversations.
I have an absolutely horrific paper for you to read. And it is about creating, and like every word of this is going to make you cringe, common sense understanding of what all AI models should be capable of. So one of the pushbacks in the ethics community, which is perfectly valid, is that the evaluation mechanisms, the benchmarks that are built when media reports things like ChatGPT performs better than Gemini, than DeepSeek. What is that assessment based on? Well, it's based on these very particular, I call them hermetically sealed lab experiments. Like, how does the AI perform on math problems and the LSATs and the MCATs and whatever? And then from that, we are supposed to believe that it is superhuman intelligent, etc., which doesn't make sense. Like, that makes no sense if you even understand a little bit of what intelligence even means. It's not about regurgitating facts, right?
Yeah.
But fine, whatever. So then the pushback is like, okay, we need better benchmarks. A bunch of people sat down and they created a common data set of knowledge. And truly, it would take you 3 seconds to look at it and immediately identify all the flaws. I'll name my favorite one, which is that there is American history, Western history. There's American history, European history, and the rest of the world. That's it. That's all the history. American, which by the way is the youngest of just about all of the nations. European, and rest of world, which by the way includes multi-millennia of societies that flourished in places like Africa, India, China, and the Middle East. All of that is just lumped into one. But
Yeah,
God forbid you not know what the Emancipation Proclamation was,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Truly, you must know what the Louisiana Purchase was, but all of Chinese history can be one footnote.
Yeah.
And it's things like that. Like, really, it's naivete, but at this point, I feel like it is willful ignorance. It is trying to take the easy way out versus the better way out. And I think the hard part for a lot of, back to what we were talking about technique and implementation being adulated, people just want to arrive at the solution. And I think the hard part about ethics and even governance is that governance is a process, not a solution. I think people want to know what the end of it is. And when they can say, yes, I have the ethical model, that is not what we aspire to. We aspire to is constant inquiry and having frameworks for inquiry that help us arrive at constantly better solutions. But there is actually not an end to it. And I think that is what's frustrating for engineers to hear, that there isn't an end to the story.
Yeah. So talk to us then a bit about any sort of commitments that are being made toward transparency about some of these things. Are the various tech companies willing to practice transparency about the things that inform this, or is it so deeply embedded in the large language models that even they don't know exactly what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I hinted at it earlier, right? So one can identify the outcome. That doesn't always mean you understand the mechanism. And the more complex these models get, the more and more difficult it is to identify the mechanism. So I'll compare and contrast like 2 ways of evaluating models. So one is like the cybersecurity method, which is, like pretending to be a hacker and getting past a firewall. So when cybersecurity experts do something like break into a system, what you do is you reverse engineer their method to make it impossible to do. So if they say, oh, I typed this code and it gave me everybody's passwords, and you're like, great, I will make it impossible to type that code. Generative AI does not work that way, especially as it comes to societal outcomes. So let's say you type in some sort of an input and you get an output. First of all, I mentioned earlier that these models are probabilistic, which means that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals somewhere between 3.9 to 4.1, but sometimes it equals 78, right? And that is not the same as saying 2 plus 2 is 4. Therefore, if my model says 2 plus 2 is 5, something's wrong, I need to fix it, right? So if I get an incorrect outcome, I am not sure whether this is a one-off fluke or hallucination, as it's called, which is, by the way, a fundamental part of these models. It is, as tech people would say, it's a feature, not a bug. That is how these models work. They are prone to hallucinate. You cannot go in and fix that or eradicate that. So that's hard. Number one, they have a probabilistic system. And number two, the mechanisms, like the many layers of data, information, et cetera, are so complex. It is nearly impossible to figure out where something came from. So if I say, for example, that your model is demonstrating gender bias, that doesn't really help you figure out how to solve it or how to fix it or how to change it. And again, this is what I was saying earlier, where engineers will get frustrated because people will say, well, I typed in, make me images of a doctor, and only brought up old white men. And it's like, yes, I think we can all identify that that is incorrect. That's not the way of the world. How you go about changing it and fixing that becomes very, very complicated. In some cases, it could be as hard as you need to rewrite the entire model, you need to curate better data from a very clear starting point. In other cases, maybe it was just a one-off fluke and it's not going to happen again. And it's really hard to differentiate the two.
Yeah. So let me go back to what you mentioned just a moment ago and ask kind of your personal experience. So you here you are at Twitter doing work that's your own exercise of transparency around some of these issues and then summarily dismissed. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I wrote an op-ed for The Atlantic about it, and I think the most surprising thing to me was the slow death of the culture at Twitter. And I want to be very clear that before it was even clear that he was buying the company, I saw the culture of this company die. And it went from a place that was actually quite open, where people could talk freely about their perspectives and push back against leadership, to a place where people just glossed over anything. You weren't allowed to say anything. God forbid you raise anything unpleasant. And it became a shadow of itself. People were
Mm.
afraid to talk on the Slack channel. If you did, like, somebody came in to say, like, "Oh, well, I don't want to talk, have all this negativity. We don't know what it's gonna be like." Like, of course you know what it's gonna be like when he comes. Um, and it was a little bit heartbreaking. It was a little bit sad to see, because, as I mentioned, tech employees are some of the best compensated, probably the best compensated field. I did not enter tech until my 30s, so that kind of income was something I did not see, and it was not my norm. And I know people who, frankly, would have had far higher moral standards making a fraction what these people made. So I really don't believe that there was a sense of precarity. You're making stupid amounts of money. If you have precarity, it's because you don't spend money well, not because you're not being paid enough. And I think it was the opposite. I think people were very comfortable in their lives, and they were hoping that that it would be fine. And they refused to see the culture crumble around them. It was a culture, again, of openness, of responsibility for your actions, about accountability, because they feared that potential incoming leadership didn't want to see it. I think that, to me, was the most heartbreaking thing. It was the most eye-opening moment, because, again, I respected Twitter as a company that had a very enduring culture, but that all came apart in less than 6 months.
What would you account as the mechanism for how quickly that culture dissolved?
Um, I think part of it was, Elon Musk i- is a larger than life character. I think it is very hard for people who are accustomed to making a lot of money to say, "Well, I'm just going to quit my job." I had told my team that no matter what happened, like, if he came, and even if our team didn't get laid off, I was just going to quit. Like, I didn't see a point or a purpose. I think some people really did believe that tech was objective, that they could still do their jobs no matter who was CEO. I think some people willfully believed that, oh, it's j we had multiple people say this, "Oh, I've lived through many CEO takeovers. It always seems like it's gonna be a big deal, and then it all blows over, and it's all business as usual." I don't know why anybody would think that, but that was at least some of the justifications that people had on the Slack channel.
Yeah. So we mentioned Jacques Ellul a moment ago. He has an odd word that I found helpful: characterology, in which he asks the question, rather than thinking of any sort of given technology as a mere tool. Instead, we ask questions about what kind of people we become by the use of that technique or that technology. From your perspective, what sorts of character is being inculcated in us widely because of the rapid rise of AI?
Transactional, highly transactional. Even if you look at the nature of social media and how it's changed over time. I am an elder millennial, and I go on TikTok, and I don't think I understand what I see anymore. And it's actually because everything has become a transaction, a public performance. I think the Gen Z term for it would be main character energy. Everyone thinks they're the main character of their own show. So when we wonder
Huh.
things like, why do people behave the way they behave in public now, with complete disregard and lack of empathy or understanding of other people, um, you can blame a lot of technology for that, because personalization algorithms have told us that we're never wrong, that we're the most important creature, we're the most important thing, and everything should be catered to as we need it and when we need it. So rather than be in a society or situation where you are sometimes a little uncomfortable, we're told that any amount of discomfort, personal discomfort, is completely unacceptable. But what is acceptable is for you to demand what you want the way you want it, because that's how things are served to you.
Hmm.
And I think that technology really has created a world that we are, that's just fully transactional. The other thing that I've been talking about for a few years at this point, but mainly starting in 2023, is how we're entering this post-truth world, that generative AI, starting with, the filter bubble of social media, but also personalization algorithms, and now deepfakes that are generative AI produced, can easily create a world that we believe is true that is completely divorced from reality. It is very, very easy to live in that world. And I think we're seeing the early manifestation is AI psychosis, all the same thing, right? This specifically curated being is living in your computer, and people really want to impute sentience on it. They want to believe it is alive. And that is a very human thing. It's actually a very beautiful human thing, to be honest, but it is a human thing that is exploited again in the name of transaction. So it is unsurprising that in Asia we see the rise of AI boyfriends. In the US, we see the rise of AI girlfriends.
Huh.
Um, yeah, and actually, I was reading a really fascinating article that China actually has more of a market in AI boyfriends, and it's because of the uh, immense pressures put on women in marriage, that women find escape in finding these like sensitive AI boys,
Huh.
rather than trying to, let's say, cultivate a marriage that's more built on equity. In the US, we have the opposite, where young men are falling down into this toxic masculine cycle, but they're able to validate that transactional energy by saying, I can make an ideal girlfriend for myself. She's never upset. She always says I'm right. She'll never say no to me. Why would I want a human girlfriend? Why would I want to be just like uncomfortable or grow as a human being when I can get everything I want from AI?
Yeah. Fascinating. Um, you have come out publicly very strongly against surveillance and saying, even, quote, there is no such thing as ethical surveillance. Unpack some of that for us.
Absolutely. So my colleague Chris Gilliard is publishing a book that he calls Luxury Surveillance, and I think that's a great way to put it. We are sold technologies of convenience. We're actually sold a narrative of fear, that we should be constantly worried for our lives and that everything should be closely monitored, everything from our health to our backyards to every movement of our children to, frankly, our pets. And all of that is contributing to this data collection surveillance state, right? All of this information and data that companies own that actually we have no clear rights to. One of the best examples of that was actually 23andMe. I never did the genetic history because it's a privately owned company, and while there's some restrictions based on HIPAA, data protection, it was unsurprising to see the company doing things like partnering with Spotify to create playlists linked to your genetics.
Oh, my.
So the concerning part about 23andMe was that when they went out of business and they were purchased by private equity, all of your genetic information is now housed by a private equity firm. And to
Mm.
some extent, that information can be used and reused as they see fit within the confines of HIPAA protection, and certain amounts of data protection, but very limited data protection. GDPR gave Europeans, General Data Protection Regulation, gave Europeans three very important rights that Americans don't have. It's the right to not be found, the right to your data and information, and also the right to visibility in how your data is used. So whenever you go abroad and you see that cookies banner that everybody unfortunately passes over, don't pass over it, because that is giving you the right to say, I want you to collect or not collect certain amounts of information about me. Americans have no such rights. I'll give you a very, very specific example. It was actually discovered by the UK Information Commission Office that the various credit bureaus were actually selling your data and information on an open market. The information that you are legally required to share as part of your credit score, right? As an American, you have to share that information. And while they found that that data was being sold by credit unions like Experian, et cetera, Europeans had a right to protections, but Americans don't. So all we do is we know that all this information that you have to give to Experian and TransUnion, et cetera, is being sold to market to you, and you have no right over any of that. So you don't have a right to say you can't collect it because you're required to for your credit score. You don't have a right to say you can't sell it because we have no such legal protections. So
Mm.
it just becomes this constant environment of being sold and being sold to. And the best book to read about this is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, where she really identifies like we are the means of productions. We're the cows making the milk. Like, everybody likes to talk about the P.T. Barnum quote, whether or not it's really P.T. Barnum. right? If you don't know what the product is you. It's actually not that at all. We are the cows making the milk, is what Professor Zuboff says, that we are just information to be pumped out, sold, resold, and then be sold to again. So we are this never-ending source and resource. Think of it more like we're the Soylent Green and less than we're the product.
What sorts of conversations have you had of ways in which the last 20 or 30 years of kind of resurgence of thinking about virtue and virtue ethics theories have had on AI and tech, if any?
So there are a few bright shining spots of people who are really great. Like my favorite philosopher in this field is Shannon Valor. She's at University of Edinburgh. She was at Santa Clara University previously. She has written some amazing books. The most recent one called The AI Mirror, I believe, on virtue ethics. I think, unfortunately, one of the slants that a lot of philosophy has taken has actually spun more around whether or not AI systems have rights and what does it mean to give rights to AI systems, and rather than to think through the construct of these systems as needing to have ethical design, ethical construct. And I find that to be very unfortunate, to be perfectly honest. But I would highly, highly recommend anything written by Shannon Valor.
Thank you. So when you think about, as we close here, kind of two relatively quick questions, though a lot could be said about them. In your work, what are some of the most pressing things that you hope we can make some advancements on that can lead us toward good ends with these tools?
I think the first thing, and one thing I've been talking about for quite some time now, and I mentioned this in the podcast, is more scientific rigor in mechanisms of evaluation. Because again, when we debate model performance or what issues should be important, it is often based on ideology and power dynamics rather than saying there is hard empirical evidence of something happening. So one of the worst smoke screens that is put up is this idea that AI will somehow gain sentience and kill us all. And I cannot think of a worse narrative because none of it even has a shred of empirical evidence, even as conducted by generative AI companies. I'm not saying like I did it. I'm saying when generative AI companies have hired firms to determine things like whether or not AI shows signs of sentience or, maliciousness, like none of it's true. It's not even remotely capable of that. And again, that requires a more sophisticated understanding of what sentience and intent actually means. And there is this, whether intentional or naive or lazy, conflation of intelligence performance, i.e., physics questions and mathematics questions, with sentience and will, which is two very, very different things from each other. There is this conflation of the two. And I think there is this implicit belief that enough smartness of an AI system means that it is somehow sentient. And that is very, very dangerous for many reasons. Intelligence is not an objective measurement. It is a social, political, and economic construct. But again, this industry just looks over that. But instead, one thing I would like to see is if we ground our conversations on empirical evidence, what are we actually seeing these models do? How are they manifesting in the real world? How are they operating as socio-technical systems, right? As in systems that exist in the confines of society. And when I call these tests like hermetically sealed lab environments, for example, we'll see these breathless headlines that say things like, an AI running an economic system decides to kill all humans. My first question is, who has decided to let AI run an economy? Like, human beings have to go. Even the concept of an economy is a human construct, right? Like, what is this world in which an AI system magically runs an economy, which again is a complex interplay of many different thousands of institutions, there is not an economy. There is not economy.gif, right? There isn't like a file that you access called the economy. And I find it is very frustrating to me because the media will pick up these absolutely purposeless analyses and run with it as if like, oh my gosh, we have to be worried about how AI systems are going to run our economies. And they will not ask very basic questions like, Maybe we shouldn't use algorithms for variable pricing in grocery stores so that when you and I walk into the same grocery store and buy the same things, you may pay more than me because, let's say, this algorithm knows that you have children and are willing to pay a higher price for milk and eggs than I would, right? Like, let's talk about that. Like, that's how AI impacts the economy, not by running it. And again, this is because evaluation is based on ideology and power, not empirical evidence.
Remarkable. So last question, and maybe here for this last question, maybe your least technical, most human constructs, language constructs. Here we are in this, this brave new world. What's it mean for you to pursue being human? Or what does it mean for you to pursue human flourishing in this age in which we find ourselves?
I find myself reading a lot. I mean, I'm a big reader anyway. Like I need to read. It's funny. Somebody once, when I hear that people in tech don't read books, my initial reaction is like, so how do you escape? Like, where do you go? Like, that's actually why I'm like, where do you go? Like, I go into books, and I find myself reading actually, and I almost entirely read fiction. And I read everything. I would truly read literally everything. The most human thing that I love to do is just reading books that are very, very well written, that have um like the most beautiful books are the ones with absolutely timeless narratives that transcend culture, ideology, race, everything, because they speak to the human condition. I will definitely say the best books that I read this year that I've for some reason put off, and I don't like, I really love Westerns, and I read the Lonesome Dove series for the first
Oh,
time.
wow. Huh.
And like truly, they're some of the best books ever written, like 100%. And, I mean, I could like I remember there's four books. The third book is Lonesome Dove. But I remember as I'm reading it, wishing, like literally wishing I was taking a literature class so that I could write essays about these books and I could talk to other people about these books. Right. That is the most human thing, is to read a book about a bunch of white men in the 1850s roaming around Texas, because they're actually in Texas, and feeling such a kinship with their story and an identification with the narratives that they're saying. That is the human condition, right? It's actually finding commonalities of what makes human beings so complex or unique or difficult. And a lot of Lonesome Dove, by the way, from my perspective, is actually about freedom and what it means to be free, and how actually often technological and societal advances limit our freedom. Because if you've read the books, like every single book it has like sort of that kind of a thing, a theme to it. So yeah, that's I think for me that is like the thing I do the most. That is my touch grass. It's just to read, and I'm constantly on the hunt for well-written books.
Been talking to Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, CEO and co-founder of Humane Intelligence. Rumman, thanks so much for your time and for your beautiful work you're doing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.